Have you ever felt it? That persistent void deep within you, even when you're doing everything right? You pray regularly, you attend church faithfully, you read scripture diligently, yet something essential seems missing. There's this unshakable feeling that there's more, something powerful just beyond your grasp. What if I told you this emptiness isn't your imagination? What if this spiritual hunger isn't because you're lacking faith, or because God is distant? What if it's because something vital, something that was meant to transform your spiritual life, has been deliberately kept from you? Since the beginning of time, the enemy has never needed violence to undermine believers. His most effective strategy has always been deception. Remember how it started in the garden? The serpent didn't arrive with weapons. He came with a question. Did God really say that? With just a few carefully chosen words, he didn't destroy Eden. He infected it with doubt. That same infection has been spreading through generations, and today it's more dangerous than ever before, because the enemy knows what most Christians don't. If he can subtly alter just a few words of scripture, if he can obscure certain spiritual truths, he can derail your entire destiny. You've probably been encouraged to memorize verses since childhood, to declare them, to build your life on them. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful revelations, the very words that could transform your spiritual life completely, have been systematically removed, not just by dark forces, but with the complicity of those who claim to represent divine truth? Think of it this way. Imagine you're in battle. You believe you're wielding a sharp, powerful sword, but someone has secretly dulled your blade while convincing you it's more effective than ever. That's what has happened to millions of faithful believers. They quote from a book that once blazed with uncensored power, but has now been carefully edited, modified, and stripped of its most transformative revelations. Not all scripture frightens the powers of darkness equally. Some verses provide comfort, others inspire hope, but a select few are so threatening to the enemy's agenda that he orchestrated their concealment at any cost. You might wonder, why would God allow this to happen? That's precisely the kind of doubt the enemy wants to plant in your mind. Because when you begin questioning the integrity of sacred writings without seeking spiritual discernment, you don't grow in wisdom. You sink into confusion, and confusion is where the enemy operates most effectively. The uncomfortable truth is that not everything that was revealed was preserved, and not everything that was removed was insignificant. There were verses, powerful declarations, that once ignited the early church with unstoppable authority. Verses that expelled demonic forces, restored broken families, and shattered generational curses. Many of these are no longer found in the pages you hold today, not because heaven failed, but because men, driven by fear or the desire for control, chose to silence what was meant to resound through the ages. Here's what should truly disturb you. You've likely been searching for answers your entire life, but the very revelation that could unlock your breakthrough has been systematically hidden from you. You were taught how to pray. You were taught to have faith, but you were never shown what was removed while you were busy being faithful. That's the wound no one discusses. That deep intuition inside you that whispers, there must be more. And there is. You weren't imagining things. You weren't spiritually deficient. You weren't failing. You've been navigating with a map that had its most critical sections deliberately torn away. And now you're about to discover why certain spiritual truths were so threatening that they vanished from most holy books and most pulpits. But before I reveal the specific ancient prayer code itself, we need to expose the strategy behind its disappearance. Because the enemy didn't simply erase a teaching, he rewrote the entire narrative. Are you prepared to see what's been hidden from you? Because what follows is what darkness has worked for centuries to conceal. If this message is stirring something in your spirit, type "reveal" in the comments as a declaration of readiness. And make sure you're subscribed, because what's coming next will revolutionize your understanding of spiritual warfare. Some battles you're facing right now aren't the result of your mistakes, your weaknesses, or even your lack of dedication. They're happening because something powerful within you is awakening, and darkness recognizes and fears what it sees emerging. In times like these, you need more than inspirational quotes or comforting platitudes. You need structure, strategy, spiritual precision. You need daily weapons forged in revelation and refined through trials. Not random devotionals or recycled inspiration, but something that addresses the spiritual war raging within and around you. Something that can fight for your soul when your own strength fails. But here's the reality. Not everyone is prepared for this level of transformation. This isn't for casual believers. It's for those who've been silent too long. For those who've tried everything and still feel trapped. For those who recognize deep within, I cannot afford to lose another battle like this again. If that's you, don't hesitate. Click the link in the first pinned comment below to access 40 days of prophetic, strategic, and spiritually potent teachings that can transform everything. We're releasing only a limited number at once, and when they're gone, they're gone. Because what's contained within was never intended for everyone. It was reserved for spiritual warriors. Consider this perspective. The enemy has studied Scripture more thoroughly than most believers ever will. Not because he believes it, but because he fears certain parts of it. Not the entire text, just the specific sections that can dismantle his kingdom. That's why his most effective strategy was never to burn holy books or outlaw houses of worship. His most brilliant move was far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. He recognized that if he could silence or distort just a few specific revelations, he wouldn't need to prevent people from attending services. He simply needed to ensure they remained powerless within them. This is the disturbing reality most people overlook. The enemy doesn't need to make you reject faith. He only needs to prevent you from accessing what was already given to you. Because the moment you activate genuine spiritual authority, his control disintegrates. And there was an ancient prayer code, a genuine teaching, that did exactly that. It wasn't merely encouraging, it wasn't simply poetic. It activated something within believers that made the forces of darkness tremble. A spiritual declaration that wasn't written for comfort, but for combat. A divine revelation that exposed demonic systems, broke hidden chains, and gave ordinary believers access to a level of authority most contemporary spiritual leaders don't dare to teach. That's why it became a target. Let me ask you something. Have you experienced moments when your prayers seemed to hit an invisible barrier? You did everything right, fasting, giving, serving, but nothing changed. That isn't because you failed. It might be because something powerful was deliberately withheld from you. There's a reason certain spiritual doors won't open, a reason some generational patterns seem unbreakable, why certain cycles repeat endlessly, why darkness keeps advancing even when you're fighting with everything you have. You're wielding a sword by its handle while its blade has been taken from you. This missing prayer code, this divine declaration, didn't just inspire faith, it was designed to release it, to unlock access, to shatter the legal claims of darkness, to remind evil forces of the judgment awaiting them, and to remind you of the authority already residing within you. But if you never speak it, if you never learn it, if you never even know it exists, then you continue living in unnecessary defeat. Not because you aren't saved, but because you're unknowingly bound. Think about this. In a legal proceeding, what wins a case isn't emotional appeals. It's the legal authority of the documents presented. And this ancient code was your legal declaration in the spiritual realm. A declaration that reminded darkness that you were not its property. You were spiritually armed. So what did the enemy do? He didn't erase it overnight. He whispered doubts to scholars. He complicated translations. He infiltrated institutions of learning with skepticism. He convinced spiritual leaders to avoid challenging topics. He manipulated doctrines to make you believe your spiritual authority depended on intermediaries, rituals, or institutions. All while the very revelation that could transform everything was buried under centuries of silence. And here's the heartbreaking part. Some of the most sincere believers are the most spiritually vulnerable because they've trusted teachers who never shared the complete truth. They've memorized verses that soothe the heart, but forgotten the ones that terrify darkness. You've been taught to celebrate grace, but were you taught to pronounce judgment against evil? You've been taught to pray for peace, but were you taught to wage war for your spiritual inheritance? This isn't merely a theological issue, it's a spiritual ambush. And while you've been told to wait patiently, the enemy has been using that time to rewrite your spiritual weapons. Now imagine this. A prayer code so precise, so devastating to darkness, that simply declaring it disrupts curses, dismantles demonic assignments, and awakens dormant authority within believers. That's what was erased. Because darkness doesn't fear emotional worship. It doesn't fear religious routines, but it fears with every fiber of its being a believer who knows their true identity and speaks with heaven's authority. Don't let this revelation pass you by. Comment "Awaken" if you're reclaiming what was stolen. Subscribe now so you never miss another truth the enemy tried to conceal from you. What comes next isn't just the history of this missing prayer code, but the reason for its removal and how you can restore it in your life. Are you ready to confront this reality? Because once you understand what this ancient revelation accomplished, you'll recognize why the enemy invested centuries trying to erase it from your spiritual heritage. If your spirit is stirring right now, that's not mere emotion. That's a call to preparation. The spiritual conflicts ahead won't be won with noise. They'll be won with strategy, consistency, and spiritual fire. That's precisely why only a limited number of the resources I've prepared are being made available. 40 days of focused spiritual training, not theory, but battle-tested guidance. If you're ready to stop reacting and start commanding, click the first pinned comment below before this opportunity vanishes. Because when the real spiritual battle intensifies, it will be too late to begin training. It's difficult to accept, but some of the most powerful spiritual truths in history weren't erased through persecution. They were erased through silence. The early believers didn't have elaborate structures, advanced technology, or global platforms. What they possessed was something the modern religious landscape often lacks: unfiltered spiritual power. Power that didn't come from charismatic presentations or elaborate programs, but from pure, undiluted truth, some of which you've never encountered. Not because it never existed, but because it was intentionally removed. There was a time when believers would share certain revelations only in private, not out of shame, but because these teachings were so potent, so spiritually confrontational, that even speaking them aloud felt like engaging in warfare. But as time passed, as genuine faith was absorbed into empires and institutions, something sinister infiltrated. Sacred texts became political tools. The revealed word, once passed through persecuted hands and burning faith, was now edited by committees, sanitized by academics, and repackaged to serve agendas. The crucial question is, who determines what should remain and what should be removed? Most people aren't aware that the earliest manuscripts, especially from the first 3 centuries, weren't standardized. Different regions had access to different scrolls, and many early believers quoted from teachings that no longer exist in contemporary sacred texts. We're discussing letters, prophetic insights, warnings, and declarations that terrified empires and shook demonic strongholds. And then they disappeared. Some were buried with martyrs, some were dismissed as too dangerous, others were rejected in closed councils by leaders who feared what those revelations might provoke. Let's be clear, not everything that was removed was false teaching. Some of it was too direct, too powerful, too confrontational, and that made it threatening, not to heaven, but to men who desired control. Imagine discovering a prayer code that identifies specific spiritual forces and instructs believers exactly how to dismantle their influence. Imagine a teaching that clearly delineates spiritual territory and declares, "This belongs to the redeemed and this does not." Imagine a revelation that bypasses religious hierarchies and places divine authority directly in the hands of the believer, no permission required. Now imagine those teachings being quietly buried, lost in translation, locked in academic vaults, or dismissed with theological labels like non-canonical, apocryphal, or too mystical. The truth is that many of these teachings existed in ancient writings, some in texts like Enoch, Esdras, the shepherd of Hermas, and others cited by early spiritual leaders. Some were included in the Septuagint, the Greek translation used and quoted from, but were later removed during various reformations. Even fragments of letters attributed to apostles or teachings beyond the commonly known Gospels were once considered worthy of study until they were suddenly deemed unnecessary. Why? Because they weren't safe. Not for governments, not for religious systems, and definitely not for the forces of darkness. Because these teachings didn't just inform, they activated. They didn't just explain theology, they exposed darkness. They didn't just point to heaven, they dismantled evil strongholds. And that's precisely why the enemy orchestrated their disappearance. Not through violence, but through bureaucracy, through revisions, through the slow but deliberate process of making sacred teachings more palatable, more respectable, more acceptable to the masses. But at what cost? Today, you hold texts that have been translated dozens of times, edited across centuries, and shaped by theological preferences, not all of them divinely inspired. You read the words that survived. But what about the ones that didn't? What if the very revelation that could liberate your family is collecting dust in a forgotten manuscript? What if the key to breaking your spiritual oppression was once common knowledge until it was silenced? And perhaps the most haunting question, what else has been hidden from you in plain sight? Because the truth is this: just because something isn't printed doesn't mean it wasn't once proclaimed. And just because it isn't accessible now doesn't mean it can't be revealed again. We're not merely discussing lost words on a page. We're talking about stolen power, silenced authority, buried blueprints for spiritual liberation. But here's the hope. Heaven never forgets what humanity erases. And in these closing days of history, there is a restoration of what was lost. The Spirit of Truth is guiding people back to revelations the enemy tried to bury. And you're being awakened to it right now, because the next part of this journey will expose something even more threatening. Not only what the missing prayer code accomplished, but why darkness still trembles when someone dares to speak it. If your spirit recognizes this is for you, write "Restore" in the comments as your first step forward. Then hit subscribe, because this is just the beginning of your spiritual reawakening. There are sacred teachings that inspire, teachings that comfort, teachings that bring peace. But then there are revelations that ignite warfare in the spiritual realm. The ancient prayer code that was erased, the one darkness couldn't allow to remain, wasn't just another spiritual teaching. It was a spiritual weapon, a catalyst, a revelation that, when spoken with conviction and faith, didn't just repel darkness, it dismantled it. What made it distinctive wasn't just the words themselves. It was what those words accomplished when declared by a believer. It wasn't poetry, it was warfare, not just a promise, but a command, a legal declaration that shifted realities in the invisible realm. Most believers are taught to pray defensively. Protect me, help me, shield me from the enemy. But this prayer code didn't plead, it didn't beg, it confronted, it stood directly in the face of spiritual opposition and declared, "You have no authority here." That's why it had to be removed. Because a believer who knows only how to plead presents no threat to darkness, but a believer who knows how to declare, how to command, how to enforce heaven's will, that person changes the atmosphere when they enter a room. Imagine a courtroom again. There's the judge, the accuser, and the accused. Most contemporary believers stand in that courtroom silent, anxious, hoping for divine intervention, but those who had access to this prayer code didn't wait for rescue. They stood boldly and quoted from the highest law. They referenced the heavenly constitution, and when they did, darkness had to retreat, because this wasn't merely scripture, it was a spiritual eviction notice. The code exposed the strategies of the enemy. It named them. It dismantled the lie that darkness had legal access to your mind, your body, your children, your home. It brought clarity to what many spiritual leaders fear teaching, that you don't need a title to carry divine authority. The early believers understood this. They knew they didn't need elaborate structures or advanced education. They needed truth spoken with fire. They entered cities dominated by idolatry and demonic influence and declared the word, and the spirits fled. Not because of their eloquence, but because of the power behind the revelation they carried. That's what this missing prayer code accomplished. It wasn't lengthy, it wasn't complicated, but it was terrifying to every dark presence that heard it, because it reminded them of the one reality the enemy tries to make you forget, that the victory didn't just defeat him, it disarmed him publicly, legally, eternally. And when you speak that truth, when you declare the word that reinforces it, every spirit of oppression, every generational curse, every assignment of darkness must respond. Not because of your personal worthiness, but because of the authority in the revelation you speak. This is why true spiritual liberation doesn't happen through emotion. It happens through alignment. When what you declare aligns with what heaven has already decreed, it creates a spiritual explosion that no darkness can withstand. That's what this prayer code accomplished. It wasn't trendy, it wasn't popular, but it worked. And that's precisely why it vanished, because it cut too deeply. It worked too effectively. It restored too much power to ordinary believers. And the enemy's greatest fear is a believer who doesn't just pray for freedom, but understands they already possess it and knows how to use their voice to enforce it. There's a reason why religious systems evolved to emphasize rituals over revelation. Why tradition replaced authority. Because the enemy knew that as long as he could keep this prayer code out of your mouth, he could keep you in spiritual bondage even while your hands are raised in worship. But no longer, because now you understand the kind of revelation that was erased, the kind of spiritual truth that doesn't just reference divine power, but releases it. And in the next part, you'll discover how even though it was removed from sacred pages, you can recover its power today, because heaven never left his people defenseless. And what was hidden by human hands can be restored by the Spirit. If you've stayed with me this far, something within you already recognizes the truth. You were never meant to fight spiritual battles unequipped. For too long, you've been trying to navigate spiritual warfare with compromised weapons, quoting familiar verses learned in childhood, holding on to promises that sound comforting. But deep inside, you've always sensed something crucial was missing. Now you understand why. That missing element wasn't your faith. It wasn't your discipline. It wasn't your worthiness. It was a revelation deliberately concealed from you, a spiritual weapon that darkness feared too much to leave accessible. But here's the liberating truth the enemy never wanted you to discover. Even if human institutions erased the words from the page, they cannot erase what heaven inscribed in your spirit. The revealed word isn't limited to ink and paper. It's alive. And when your spirit aligns with heaven, revelation flows again. So how do you recover what was stolen? You don't need to search through ancient manuscripts or decipher forgotten languages. You need to invite the Spirit to rekindle what was buried within you. Because the Spirit still speaks, the Spirit still reveals, the Spirit still breathes life into what has been dormant for generations. Start here. Ask to receive eyes that see the revelations you've overlooked, truths that have been right before you, waiting to be declared with boldness. Open sacred texts not just to read, but to recover and speak, not with hesitation, but with heaven-backed authority. Remember, the power isn't in the volume of your voice. It's in the alignment of your words with divine truth. The moment you speak what heaven has declared, chains begin to break. You don't need institutional validation. You don't need a title, a platform, or a building. You need conviction. You need understanding. You need to recognize that what was spiritually stolen from you is now being restored. The missing prayer code was never merely about text. It was about access. Access to power, access to identity, access to authority. And now you have it again. So when the enemy whispers that you're still bound, when he insists that nothing has changed, when he tries to remind you of the silence that once haunted you, speak. Declare what you now know. Reclaim what darkness erased. Call back what religion buried. Because your voice isn't just sound, it's a weapon, and your faith is the key to unlocking what hell tried to hide. This is your moment to transition from victim to warrior, to stop merely surviving and start reclaiming territory. The same power that accomplished the ultimate victory isn't just visiting you, it's residing within you. And now that you know the truth, you can't return to ignorance. Now that you've seen the strategy, you can't continue in blindness. Now that you've heard what was hidden, you face a choice: remain silent or speak with fire. Because once the erased prayer code is revived in your life, nothing remains the same, and the enemy knows it. Thank you for joining me throughout this revelation. Thank you for refusing to be another passive believer. Thank you for daring to seek what others were too afraid to question. If this message has ignited something within your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, declare it, live it. Leave a comment below that simply says, "I reclaim it." Because today you've taken back what was stolen, and this is just the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next part of this series, where we'll go even deeper into the ancient prayer code and how to apply it in your daily life. If this video has impacted you, give it a like and share it with someone who needs this revelation. Remember, what was hidden from generations is now being revealed to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The question is, will you be one of them?